Hello and welcome to the last in this series of bonus podcasts, Investments Unwrapped, brought to you by MoneyWeek and the Platinum Card from American Express, a card that offers over 30 travel and lifestyle benefits. In this show, we look not at the week gone by, but the years ahead, exploring the world of alternative investments. We've met purveyors of rare books, fine wine, antique furniture and classic cars, and today we glance down to our own wrists and the watches that adorn them. How might a pre-owned timepiece enrich your style and your wallet? I'm Olly Mann, and this is Investments Unwrapped. And joining me once again is MoneyWeek's executive editor, John Stepek. Hello, John.
Hi, Ollie.
Welcome. You have disappointed us on almost every level across this series. We've discovered that you own no valuable books and drive a Nissan Juke. But I'm going to ask the question, what's on your wrist?
I like to be a man of consistency, Ollie, so I'm going to have to show you that my wrist is entirely naked.
It's naked. And not even a swatch.
Not even a swatch.
Okay, so how do you tell the time? Are you a smartphone user?
Well, I use phones, but actually, I made a conscious decision in my early 20s not to ever bother wearing a watch again, because I realised that the time is everywhere. It's like, it's on your microwave, it's, and it's on the town clock, so I never felt the need for it. So.
I love how you just undermine this whole concept straight from the beginning. Don't buy a watch, look at your microwave. Well, I'm pleased to say there are other reasons to buy timepieces, of course. Not least their aesthetic qualities, and a man who does know all about that is Silas Walton, founder and CEO of The Collected Man and a dealer of ultra-rare pre-owned watches. Hi, Silas.
Hi, Ollie.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It seems in a way, I'll go back to John, I guess, on this in a minute in terms of the financial value, but it seems in a way like against all the kind of alternative investments we've discussed in this series, watches are sort of the perfect compromise. They have the aesthetics of art, but they're more convenient to carry around, and they're vintage, like classic cars, but they require less work to restore them. They're a pretty good investment, aren't they?
Well, yes, you picked up on a couple of the points that I would have straight away pointed out. Yeah, look, what's better than something that you can wear and enjoy, that's easy to store, that's easy to carry? In the case of the UK tax laws, has no capital gains tax on the point of sale, like classic cars, but that equally in today's market is doing very, very well. So I agree with you on all points.
Why pre-owned, though? Because there are some people that just would always prefer something new, and it's not as if there aren't high-end brands you can buy.
So there are broadly two scenarios when buying a watch new, and I say very broadly because it's quite a generalized summary. Traditionally, you'd buy a watch out of a store and immediately it was worth 30% less than you paid for it by virtue of the fact that, you take off the VAT and the fact that it's not brand new anymore. So in most cases, you'd buy a watch from any major or medium-sized brand and you'd immediately be depreciating. Otherwise, you'd be buying from a tiny selection of blue chip brands like Rolex and Patek Philippe and Unwrapped. And if you were choosing one or two of their kind of really hot options, you might walk out and that watch would be worth 2 or 3 times what you paid instantly. The problem is it's basically very, very, very difficult to get them, and there's vastly more demand than supply. So pre-owned, obviously, now is an attractive option because you can go all the way back through time. There are loads of affordable options that have essentially the same qualities and characteristics as the new watches, in some cases much better, and they represent in various pockets incredible value for money.
And so what are the things to look out for in pre-owned watches that might make them a worthwhile investment? Valuable not only now, but likely to go up in value in the future?
So it's tricky. If you exclude let's say the hype watches that I referenced earlier, the watches like the Patek Philippe Nautilus or Rolex Daytona or any other kind of classic luxury watch, then I think you have to look and you exclude areas where basically the prices are just very, very high, like independent watchmaking, where it's, 10 watches made a year type of thing. Then the area that at the moment I think is catching the most interest is what I would call neo-vintage. So it's watchmaking that's been made, watches that were made in the sort of say the 80s, 90s, 2000s, early 2000s, that basically was unloved for several decades, even from when they came out. after they were bought new, they didn't necessarily appreciate in value. Many of them just lost value.
But is that because they were ugly?
No, it's just that, look, it's beauty's in the eye of the beholder, as are fashionable tastes. Obviously, things are cyclical. I think that inevitably, as other things become out of reach, people start to look for value elsewhere, and aesthetic tastes obviously evolve as well. Right now, there's a lot of retro fashion taste, but those vintage pieces that were unpopular 3 or 4 years ago are now worth 3 or 4 times what they were.
Okay, that's a great word, neo-vintage. Just give us an example of a watch that we may have heard of from a brand we may have heard of that's neo-vintage.
Sure. So you may not have heard of the watch, but you'll certainly have heard of the brand. So Unwrapped AP created something called the Ultra Slim Automatic Perpetual Calendar. They were the first to introduce it, I think in 1972 or 78, don't quote me. But essentially, when they came out with that watch, it was just after something called the quartz crisis that basically massively undermined the Swiss watch industry and resulted in something like a third of all watchmakers being fired, essentially the introduction of quartz technology. And when Audemars Piguet came out with this watch, they were the first to ever invent that complication in that kind of automatic form that was so slim on the wrist, and it basically saved them. And today, for a long time, you could pick those things up relatively cheaply, 5, 6, 7,000 pounds. Now they're 30 or 40,000 pounds, and that's all been in the space of about 2 or 3 years.
Okay, so John, Silas is talking about this market as if, it doesn't have a roof. Even the stuff that was unloved in the past is always going to be worth more now. But that's not entirely true, is it? As we've seen with all the other investments we've talked about, it is possible that fashions change in the opposite direction too.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Again, as with all the other investments we've talked about, the one feature that's common to them all is that they're trophy assets, which means essentially the amount of money that's floating around in the world in rich people's pockets has a massive, massive influence on the value of these items. So it's the kind of rising tide will lift all boats kind of argument. Now, that goes for all assets, even kind of financial ones. Then within that, something I find really interesting about watches compared to probably actually all the other assets that we've kind of talked about in this series is that more than any of the rest of them, they are very much fashion. In the kind of the area that we're talking about is basically men's jewellery. So obviously there's a kind of fashion element to furniture, certainly. There's a kind of faddishness sometimes to wine as well. Rare books they're always going to be at the uncoolish end of the kind of collectible spectrum. But I think with watches, they're a visible status symbol as well, which is something that you don't really see with a lot of the other kind of assets that we've talked about. Maybe the cars to an extent, but you're wearing a watch on your wrist the whole time. But as a result of that, there is going to be more of a fashion element to it, because it's got to be something that has a certain kind of cachet or that is kind of viewed as cool. And I think you see that actually in the way that watches have become more of a, dare I say it, a kind of asset class than they once were.
Yeah, this is sort of the last 10 years, really, hasn't it? That this has really taken off.
It's very much a kind of social media has sort of revolutionised it in a way. And again, that just boils down to the fact that it is a fashion item relative to something like a bottle of, Burgundy or something like that. So I just think that's something you just have to bear in mind if you're getting into this stuff. And it's hard to build a diversified portfolio. There are some watch funds which we can maybe talk about later, but most of the time you're going to be sinking all your money into a single watch.
And also, compared to some of the other things we've been talking about, John, I do wonder about the insurance. You are, as you say, wearing it on your wrist. That means you can get mugged. It means you can lose it down a drain. That can't really happen with a Jaguar.
The insurance on a Jag's going to set you back a fair amount as well, I think. But you're right. You would have to put this... it's a good question. I think, your household insurance obviously covers things. You can take the options to cover things that are away from home. But if you're wearing something that's worth about 20 or 30 odd thousand on your wrist, you're probably going to have to be talking to, it might be worth talking to an insurance broker about kind of like specialist insurance for these items.
It's funny that, isn't it, Silas? Because obviously Instagram has become a place sort of equivalent to going to a black tie dinner or a cool nightclub where you wear your posh watch. But Instagram isn't real life. Maybe you don't wear it all the time. Maybe you don't wear it when you pop down to the shops. Do your clients wear their watches daily?
So I agree with everything that John said. And I do think that Instagram has created its own unusual kind of cultural phenomena. We have clients of all dispositions. So we have clients who wear their watches daily and don't think about it. Although I'm not really wearing an example of investment grade watch today, I wear my watches every day. I know clients who wear their sort of £100,000 watch whilst they're washing the car, although maybe that's an extreme example. But you do have other clients, of course, who do treat this more as an investment. And as John mentioned, the phenomena of watches emerging as an alternative investment class is really, I would say, only in the last 5 or 6 years that it's kind of emerged with any kind of seriousness. Pre-owned watches was basically a cowboy space 8, 9, 10 years ago. Today, it's whilst it's not a regulated market, it's a much more sophisticated, a much more liquid market than it used to be, and that's really only happened through the emergence of larger online platforms and greater transparency in terms of data and results through auction houses, and actually more than anything, just the consumer becoming more and more educated and sharing information between them,
and being able to spot a fake as well. I mean, there are some pretty good replicas, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean the truth is, I mean I've been doing this 8 years. We've never had a fake come through our door, but I think it's probably because of the type of watch that we specialize in on the rare end of the spectrum. It wouldn't make sense for someone to go to the trouble of creating a fake for something that was only made in 5, 10, or 100 examples. But absolutely, there are fake Rolexes out there today that, good luck telling the difference between that and a real Rolex. You really need to have an eye for it. I definitely wouldn't be able to tell you. I don't come across them very often at all, but the fakers are certainly increasingly sophisticated and increasingly accurate, so it's something to be aware of.
And if you don't want to wear it, if you are just buying it as an investment, a bit like the fine wine which gets kept in a cellar you never see, is there an option to do that if you don't want it in a safe in your own home, if you don't want people to know that you have that asset in your own home?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure if there are companies that specifically tailor to that need, but many people store their watches in bank vaults, and until a few years ago, you could buy a brand new watch from a blue chip brand and ask them not to take it out of the packaging. So we have clients, we know people, you see them coming up at auction every so often. A watch that was discontinued and stopped being made 10 years ago that was already very much in demand is being sold on the auction block, still in its original double sealed packaging and boxing, equivalent to a kind of perfect barn find car kind of thing. And people store those in the bank and they forget about it for 5 years and come back and then sell it. And it's, in some cases, a very healthy return.
How important are the original parts? And does that extend to the strap, if that's not a stupid question?
No, it's not a stupid question at all. The original parts are very important, I would say, with certain vintage watches. So the higher you go up the price bracket, the rarer the watch, the more kind of sensitive the community is to, or collecting community is to a particular kind of condition, the more careful you have to be. So obviously it's like the vintage Rolex, the vintage Patek, the vintage Audemars Piguet, the Royal Oaks, those sorts of things. But when you're towards the newer end of the spectrum, you take a watch in to be serviced, which is something that we haven't talked about as an ongoing cost, but like insurance, it's something to be aware of. You take a watch to be serviced and automatically a brand will basically want to render your watch like new. And so they'll just substitute out the parts that are no longer fit for purpose with brand new parts. And that's not really an issue for a long time, unless your watch becomes vintage. And after 20 or 30 years, then you have to start to think about whether removing those parts detracts from its inherent value. You asked about straps, from my point of view, zero value whatsoever. Sometimes, people are shocked, but it's just a piece of leather that was always going to kind of end up in a relatively miserable state after a certain amount of time and a certain amount of wear, and it has no inherent value. And yeah, I wouldn't worry about that.
It sounds like a lot of research, John. Silas's reference to the collectible community or the collectors community was quite telling, wasn't it? There's obviously a lot of people that are very passionate about this, spend a lot of time looking at websites all about it. Even if they never intend to buy a watch or spend many hours before they then go ahead to make the purchase, you can sometimes just feel a bit overwhelmed and just not qualified. If it's a case of, I wanted to ask my wife for a Christmas present, I haven't got the time to spend. I was thinking about it.
Again, it goes back to what another issue with trophy assets, which is that you do need to have an interest in them. I tend to think for it to be worth your while. At the end of the day, if you're going to spend 30,000, or you say you've got 30,000 to spend, then why are you choosing a watch rather than wine or rare books maybe, or a car? It's like, so you've got to be kind of at least slightly interested in this stuff beforehand. Otherwise, what you have to accept is that you might buy something that doesn't go up in value. If you just want a nice watch, then there are plenty of nice watch shops, and there's plenty of ones to get. But if you're actually wanting to make an investment, then you are going to have to do your homework, or you're going to have to, at the very least, speak to a few experts and get a sort of consensus from them on what's worth your while buying, because you can't navigate these areas the same way as you can't buy a FTSE 100 tracker for a watch. You have to do the homework and effectively individually stock pick.
Okay, so Silas, if you have an entry-level amount of money, and in this space, I suppose that's still thousands, but maybe not 30,000, where do you look, and what kind of things should you be looking for?
So it's tricky, assuming you can't buy any of the new watches that are just, where the demand massively exceeds supply, and you're looking at pre-owned, then I think that, very briefly touching on your point, you absolutely have to do your homework. And that's the difference between now and, say, 10 years ago. There was no transparency. There was no sharing of information in the community. Now there's a lot of information out there, and you can figure things out for yourself. But what you want to do is figure out, what's the, first of all, you definitely want to buy the best you can afford. Like in this sort of situation, you want to say to yourself, what can I afford to put away for 3-4 years? But you want to go for the kind of the best brands you can potentially afford.
Well, on that though, are you before you get on to the quality of the piece, which I'm sure is the next thing, but are you better off getting a scuffed Rolex than a Breitling that's in better condition?
Probably, yes. That's the kind of, that's the God's honest truth. And of course, the reality is, if you find a scuffed Rolex that looks like it's been unloved but basically untouched for 20 or 30 years, and it's been in a drawer or worn by someone who didn't really appreciate what its worth was and didn't care, it's a very good chance that watch will be untouched. And yes, you may have a servicing bill at the start if you have to bring it back to life. That's a little bit chunky, but you're more likely to have a sort of unpolished gem underneath.
Okay. And I interrupted you. Sorry. What are the other things to look for then? So brand and what?
Well, you want to look at condition. You want to look at provenance. You want to look at completeness of the set. Does it have its paperwork? Does it have its box?
Is it Swiss? Does it need to be Swiss?
I mean, in most cases, anything sort of vintage is basically going to be Swiss or to a much lesser extent Japanese with Grand Seiko. There are lots of options out there, but it's, the truth is, the further you go up the tree and the more cautious you are in your research, and the more you pursue kind of the very best example you can find in all the kind of boxes that need to be ticked, the better chance you have of something that will either hold its value or increase in value over time. Avoid something that aesthetically looks like it's never going to be fashionable again. Fashions are absolutely cyclical, as discussed, and tastes change. But I would point out that there just seem to be more and more people coming into this space. Genuinely in the last couple of years, North America and Southeast Asia in particular, those markets have boomed. And so the temperamentality of fashion cycles, taste cycles, seems to have reduced. But that's just from my perspective.
And do you think there's any market in kind of high street brands that you could buy now, that are 10 years old? I don't know, a watch by Michael Kors or Tommy Hilfiger or something like that actually, just because it represents a place in time in fashion, might in 30 years' time be considered not like a Rolex, but as a collectible?
It's perfectly possible. It's much, much, much harder to trend spot or kind of have a sort of clairvoyant in that space, because of course you're talking about watches that are being made in often hundreds of thousands of units, and they have battery operated movements, which typically exclude them from an investment perspective, which is something to consider. Mechanical watchmaking is really the kind of the starting point for an investment watch, again, with a few exceptions. But there are examples. There's a brand called Ikepod that was exclusively basically started by design. It was basically a design watch with very simple movements that could be compared to a Michael Kors 30 years ago, 20 years ago. And today, because of that association with, I think it's Jonathan Ives and other people like that, those watches have become collectible within a specific community of design-orientated people, which is very cool. But it is a much less probable bet. Let's put it that way.
That's really interesting too, because there's an element, what you're sort of talking about there, Ollie, is almost the nostalgia kind of kick, which is almost like you're kind of buying the watch for a different reason. You're buying it for the same reason that people are paying, tens of thousands of pounds for Nintendo kind of like consoles from when they were, kind of 9 years old. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that nostalgia market is potentially massive. I remember having a digital watch that played Space Invaders when I was like 6, and I'm sure somebody would pay something stupid for something similar, but it's on a different basis.
If that had been your answer to my first question, John, I'd have been so delighted if you still were wearing your digital watch that played Space Invaders.
If only. Any listeners who've got a spare one, feel free to send it
in. Finally, Silas, I've been asking everyone in this series this same question, but what's your investment heaven and your investment hell? Can you give us an example of a watch investment that really paid off for you, so we get a sense of scale, and one where you really did your nuts?
Sure. So I should quantify, because of what I do, probably it's a bit of an outlier of an example at least in one case. But the thing that maybe didn't go as well was I bought a vintage Rolex, a Submariner, something called a 5513, about 5 or 6 years ago, when I didn't really know anything about vintage watches, didn't know anything about vintage Rolex. I just wanted one. And I bought something through someone that I trusted, and it was good. It was great, but it wasn't amazing. And, a watch that typically you would have expected to have made, 10, 15, 20% on, within 2 years. I basically just about got out with the money that I put in. So I didn't lose money, and it wasn't a disaster by any sense, but it was probably a good lesson for me to not dip into an area that I really didn't have any knowledge in. So I tried to specialize. And the area that I'm specialized in, that we lead in, which is independent watchmaking, I bought a watch for a lot of money, for £92,000 in September 2019. It was an early F. Pigeon Tourbillon, which is a sort of blue chip of independent watchmaking. The watch was 25, 30 years old, made in only 5 or 6 examples. And I sold it for about 4.5 times what I paid about 5 or 6 months ago. And, that's not an uncommon story in that space. So my lesson there, I suppose, or the moral of the story is there. Obviously, I had the good fortune of having access to information and things that most people don't. But I really went deep into one area, and I focused on the absolute best I could buy within the kind of rarest segment of the market I could find. And then I did my homework, and then I committed and held my breath. And, there was a bit of gambling involved, I suppose, but it kind of worked out.
That pretty much summarises everything we've learned across this series, really. So thank you for that. Silas Walton, founder and CEO of The Collected Man. And thank you very much, John, as well. Have you learned something, John, in this series? Are you going to be putting your money into anything that it wasn't in before?
I've learned that the most important thing overall is to be fascinated by these particular interests, and you really need to be able to specialise. And I actually think that Silas's last story there kind of just sums it up. One nice thing about these areas is that if you are interested, then, talking about financial markets here, but they're inefficient markets relative to financial markets. So if you actually know what you're talking about, there's a much better chance of uncovering something that is genuinely a bargain. Whereas, if you're looking through the most researched 100 stocks in the British market, then you're unlikely to know something that everyone else doesn't. So that's a really interesting thing about collectibles.
Yeah, love the things you invest in. Who can say that for an ISA? Well, that is it. This series has been brought to you by the Platinum Card from American Express and MoneyWeek. The Platinum Card from American Express allows you to save as you spend, earning you a membership rewards point for every £1 you spend on your card. Your points can be used to pay for almost any item on your card statement, and they never expire. So you can save them up and spend them when the time is right. What's more, the Platinum Card also offers over 30 travel and lifestyle benefits, including airport lounge access, worldwide travel insurance, as well as a 24/7 concierge service that can help you spend your time wisely whilst away. To find out more about what the Platinum Card has to offer, just search Amex Platinum. Annual fee £575, terms and conditions apply. If you prefer a card without any rewards, other features, or a card membership fee, an alternative is available, the basic card. The information spoken about in this podcast does not constitute personal advice to invest and is not a personal recommendation on the specific products mentioned. If you're not sure whether an investment of this type is right for you, please seek advice from suitable financial advisors who will be able to advise based on your personal circumstances. If you choose to invest, the value of your investment could be at risk and fall, so you could get back less than the amount you put in originally. Investing in luxury watches is not regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. And thanks for joining us for this spin-off series. In a return to normal programming, do follow the Week Unwrapped right now via your podcast app of choice, and you'll have our new episodes delivered to your device each and every Friday. I've been Olly Mann, the producers Sophie King and Lauren Armstrong-Carter at Rethink Audio. Bye-bye.